We tell ourselves that we listen when we only hear. The world moves quickly and attention becomes a scarce resource in modern life. In that scarcity, our ears collect sound without necessarily changing anything inside us. This film begins with a simple but unsettling question about what listening actually does to a person. It asks whether listening might be the most underrated moral and intellectual skill we possess. By the end, we will see how it reshapes relationships and thought. Hearing is a biological process that registers vibrations and converts them into signals for the brain. Listening requires intention, interpretation, and often a willingness to be changed by what you hear. Those three additions make listening more like work and less like passive reception. The distinction between hearing and listening matters because it changes the outcome of conversations in real ways. A room full of hearing people can still be empty of understanding and meaning. Learning to distinguish these acts is the first practical step toward deeper connection. Neuroscience tells us that attention is the gateway to perception and memory formation. When attention is allocated, a cascade of neural processes prioritize and encode the information that reaches consciousness. Without attention, sounds remain transient noise rather than seeds of understanding. This is why listening with full presence feels different at a cellular level and a psychological one. Presence allows us to encode more nuanced patterns in speech and emotion. It also allows us to recall and act on what we have heard later, which is the basis of trust and competence. Full presence begins with a deliberate slowing down of internal habits and mental chatter. The practice requires us to notice impulses to interrupt, advise, or mentally rehearse responses while someone speaks. Resisting those impulses creates a psychological space where real listening can occur. Presence also has a physical architecture that is easy to train through posture and breath. Erect posture, relaxed shoulders, and steady breathing are small bodily signals that cue the mind to focus outward. These simple adjustments change the interior chemistry of attention and make listening easier. Listening is not just about information exchange, but about relationship building between minds and hearts. When someone feels truly heard, their emotional state shifts towards safety and openness. This shift allows complex ideas and difficult truths to surface without immediate defensiveness. In many contexts, listening functions as an ethical practice of respect and recognition. Recognizing another person through full attention affirms their value in a way that words often cannot. This moral dimension gives listening a civic importance beyond personal benefit. Respectful listening is often quieter than we imagine and more active than silence alone. It requires asking clarifying questions and reflecting what you hear without inserting your own assumptions. This reflective posture communicates attention and decreases misinterpretations between people. Respect in listening also means tolerating discomfort without rushing to fix the other person. Many listeners rush to solutions because they fear emotional intensity or ambiguity. Staying beside someone in their discomfort demonstrates a different kind of competence built on patient presence. Judgment is one of the most insidious enemies of listening because it works beneath conscious awareness. When our minds quickly categorize and evaluate, we stop listening to what is actually being said and start listening to our own assumptions. This cognitive shortcut saves energy, but it also destroys possibility. Listening without judgment means developing curiosity that resists immediate evaluation and instead probes with open questions. It asks for narrative rather than bullet points and seeks surprise rather than confirmation. Practicing this habit over time rewires our social instincts from defending to discovering. The relationship between listening and wisdom stretches across history from philosophers to spiritual teachers. Many traditions place listening at the center of learning because the act opens the mind to complexity rather than simplistic answers. Listening becomes the vessel through which nuance, paradox, and long-term thinking arrive. Wisdom, therefore, is not only accumulated information, but a cultivated capacity to suspend conclusion and hold multiple truths. Listening trains that capacity by requiring patient attention to ambiguity and contradiction. In a world that prizes speed, listening cultivates the slow mind that wisdom needs. Good listening is both receptive and active, an oscillation between silence and carefully chosen response. Paraphrasing what you heard and asking calibrating questions are small active moves that deepen mutual understanding. Those moves also prevent projection and foster accountability in conversation. Listening as an active practice also includes tracking your own emotional responses and biases in real time. Noting when you feel threatened or amused helps you separate your internal reactions from the other person's words. This self-monitoring turns listening into a disciplined practice rather than a passive habit. There are practical exercises that make listening a tangible skill rather than a vague virtue. One effective exercise pairs two people who take turns speaking for fixed intervals while the listener only reflects and asks one question. This constraint trains attention and reduces the urge to advise prematurely. Another exercise is called the silent mirror, where participants recount emotional memories while the listener practices non-reactive presence. These exercises foster endurance in attention and teach how to hold emotional content without collapsing into judgment. With repetition, the exercises become habits that reshape daily interactions. Listening practices translate into measurable improvements in professional settings like leadership and negotiation. Leaders who listen well gather better intelligence and build stronger teams because they cultivate psychological safety. Negotiations where parties feel heard tend to produce more creative and durable solutions. This is partly because listening transforms zero-sum thinking into collaborative problem solving. When parties feel understood, they are more willing to explore mutual gains and consider trade-offs. The economic and organizational dividends of listening are therefore both practical and strategic. Listening can also be a political act that challenges power structures and amplifies marginalized voices. When those with influence listen, they create space for perspectives that would otherwise be suppressed. This active listening is both an ethical commitment and a tactical shift toward justice. Conversely, refusal to listen reinforces dominance and silences dissenting experiences, which perpetuates harm and misunderstanding. In civic life, listening becomes a practice of inclusion and accountability. It is therefore not neutral but deeply political in its consequences. Sometimes listening requires courage because it unveils truths that unsettle our identities and choices. Admission of error or incomplete knowledge often follows careful listening, and that humility can feel destabilizing. Yet it is precisely this destabilization that allows learning and ethical growth to occur. Philosophically, courage and curiosity combine in listening to form a moral posture that is forward-facing rather than defensive. This posture allows conversation to become a place of mutual transformation. Listening thereby becomes both the method and the medium of moral growth. There are common obstacles that prevent people from listening well even when they mean to. Multitasking, smartphone distraction, and social anxieties all fragment attention and make listening brittle. Habitual defensiveness and the compulsion to perform cleverness also cut off the deeper currents of conversation. Recognizing these obstacles is the first step, because awareness allows deliberate countermeasures to be put in place. Simple environmental and behavioral choices like silencing devices and scheduling focused conversations reduce friction. The more we remove these obstacles, the more our listening can flourish. Listening without judgment often requires rephrasing our internal monologues into questions that explore rather than condemn. Instead of immediately labeling a statement as right or wrong, ask how the speaker reached that conclusion and what they value. That small cognitive shift expands understanding and reduces conflict. Training this habit takes time because our brains naturally seek certainty and closure. Practicing curiosity as a reflex, rather than critique, rewires the neural pathways toward openness. Over time, the listener becomes a space where others can safely articulate complexity instead of hiding it. Listening and storytelling are interdependent because stories reveal frameworks and fears beneath surface claims. Good listening invites fuller narratives that expose motives, wounds, and hopes. Once these deeper stories are heard, empathy becomes more accurate and less sentimental. This relationship means that to improve listening, you must also become a better listener of stories. Not just facts. Encourage people to narrate their experiences in sequence and detail, and resist the urge to reduce them to summary. The narrative dimension of listening turns information into humane understanding. There is a spiritual dimension to attentive listening that many traditions elevate into a practice of attention and compassion. Contemplative practices like meditation train the mind to rest in awareness rather than chase distraction. These practices create the inner conditions that make sustained listening possible. You do not have to adopt a religious doctrine to benefit from contemplative attention, but many who practice report deeper presence and patience. That inner calm allows listeners to meet intense emotions without being swept away. The result is a steadier capacity to hold and understand complex human material. Practical habits can be adopted by anyone to strengthen listening muscles in daily life and relationships. One daily habit is the 5-minute check-in, where partners or colleagues speak uninterrupted for exactly 5 minutes while the other listens. This ritual institutionalizes presence and gradually increases tolerance for emotional content. Another practical habit is structured journaling about overheard conversations and your reactions to them, which develops meta-awareness about personal listening biases. These small practices compound over weeks and months into a visible transformation of conversational culture. Consistency, not intensity, tends to produce the deepest results. Teaching listening in schools and organizations could change how societies deliberate and decide at scale. If students learn to listen before they learn to debate, public discourse might become less performative and more inquisitive. Organizational decisions could then include a wider range of perspectives and better long-term thinking. Scaling listening requires institutional design that rewards humility and curiosity rather than immediate cleverness. Meetings would include time for reflective silence and practices that ensure quieter voices are heard. Designing institutions around listening is an act of civic design with long-term societal payoff. Listening has a paradoxical relationship with power because it both softens authority and amplifies legitimacy. Powerful people who listen gain credibility and insight, while retaining authority because their decisions are informed by broader input. Conversely, power without listening breeds blind spots and systemic failure. This paradox suggests that listening is not weakness but an advanced form of governance and leadership. It requires confidence to admit what you do not know and patience to acquire information from unexpected places. Wise power, therefore, integrates listening as a core competency. Listening also deepens creative work by exposing artists and thinkers to translational sparks that surface only in dialogue. Many creative breakthroughs come from sustained listening to feedback and lived experience rather than isolated genius. In this way, listening becomes a tool for innovation as much as for empathy. Collaborative environments that cultivate listening encourage risk-taking because participants trust that their fragile ideas will be heard and refined rather than dismissed. This trust turns iteration into a safe laboratory for novel thought. Listening thus increases the probability of original and meaningful creation. There are ethical limits and responsibilities attached to listening that we must acknowledge plainly. Listening to pain requires appropriate action when harm is disclosed, and silence alone is never an ethical endpoint. True listening often compels one to intervene or to help translate empathy into practical support. Likewise, privacy and consent matter when handling someone's stories because listening can expose vulnerable information. Responsible listeners learn how to carry stories without exploiting them and how to know when to refer to professional help. Ethical listening, therefore, pairs attention with accountability. Listening to history teaches us how entire societies have failed or succeeded at being attentive to significant voices. Historical movements often emerge when listening shifts from an elite circle to a wider public. Studying these patterns helps us recognize how listening can be democratized or monopolized by institutions. The historian of listening finds that marginal voices, when truly attended to, change the arc of policy and culture. Those shifts usually begin with small acts of presence by allies or insiders who decide to prioritize testimony over convenience. History thus becomes a classroom for how listening scales into social change. On a personal level, investing in listening changes how we are known and how we know others over years. Relationships deepen not because of grand gestures, but because of countless small moments. When one person felt truly heard, those cumulative moments build the trust tissue that sustains intimacy and cooperation. Practically, this means choosing presence even in mundane moments like car rides and meals, because meaningful listening often happens in ordinary spaces. Over time, these choices transform personality and social networks in ways that are visible and enduring. Listening thus becomes a long-term craft that sculpts a life. If you want to start listening better tomorrow, begin with 3 small commitments you can keep consistently. First, create a device-free zone during your next conversation to minimize distractions and honor the other person. Second, practice paraphrasing for 1 minute before you respond to ensure you actually understood their words. Third, schedule a weekly 5-minute check-in with someone you care about to institutionalize presence and make listening habitual. These commitments are simple and scalable, and they compound into deeper competence over months and years. The more routine they become, the more natural listening will feel. Listening changes thinking because it slows cognitive tempo and opens the imagination to alternative views. It turns argument into exploration and replaces binary outcomes with layered possibilities. This cognitive shift becomes essential in complex problem solving, where certainty is elusive. The philosophical payoff is that listening cultivates epistemic humility, which is the awareness of the limits of one's knowledge and the value of other minds. That humility is a prerequisite for cooperation, learning, and moral growth. In this sense, listening is not merely social polish, but an epistemic virtue. As a practice, listening resists the culture of immediacy and demands an investment in slow presence over quick reaction. It asks us to be less interested in winning conversations and more committed to discovering truth together. This orientation is both radical and desperately needed in our polarized moment. If more of us listened as a first response, public discourse might become less performative and more deliberative. The habits of listening ripple outward from private conversations to institutions and communities. That ripple effect is the quiet revolution waiting to be led by ordinary people. In the end, listening is a bridge between knowledge and compassion, between philosophy and daily life. It trains the mind to be attentive and the heart to be responsive, creating a rare alignment that fosters wisdom. That alignment changes how we act in the world and how we judge ourselves over time. If this exploration gave you a new perspective, consider trying one listening exercise this week and observe the difference it makes. If you found value in this conversation, subscribe to keep exploring ideas that shape how we think and live. Listening well is a practice worth returning to again and again.